In 1492, Columbus found a new land across the Atlantic, or at least a land new for Europeans. And the world of Western man was increased by 2 continents. Then in 1507, a German map maker published a map of the world incorporating the new discoveries, and he called the new lands America, after Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator in the service of Spain. He could have called them Columbia after Columbus, but America, the new lands, remained. And the American dream was born to fire the imagination of those who didn't like the reality they saw around them in Europe, the violence and the corruption of the old world. In America, naked savages shared what they possessed. They had simple needs. They led harmonious lives. They were naturally good. America was a world that had escaped the fall. It had never known original sin. It was a golden world, truly golden, because it was full of treasure. Gold, silver, land for the taking, not to mention tobacco. The happy noble savage never existed, of course, and those inhabitants who did exist were soon wiped out by war, disease, and exploitation. But noble American savages peopled European utopias from the 16th century to the 20th. American utopia became a part of European consciousness. In the great open plains, American life was seen as closer to God and nature, simpler, more human. You could enjoy the purity of pioneer life, grappling with nature, coming to terms with it. You could find not just treasure, but freedom, liberty, true democracy. These concepts have haunted the European imagination since the first discoveries, and they've become part of the political rhetoric of America itself. Freedom and democracy were going to take a little time, however, because the first dream of America was really about riches. It was the hope of riches that drove hard, cruel, persistent men to conquer and settle new lands across the Atlantic, to fight over them, to kill, loot, exploit, enslave, finally to organize new societies on the ruins of what they found and took. The new societies came first in South America and the Caribbean, where Spain founded an extraordinary empire. The empire was bureaucratic, prosperous, stable, sophisticated, no more oppressive than Spain, less heavily taxed than Spain, more advanced than Spain, and certainly more advanced than the less attractive lands to the north. Where the north was muddy villages, the south was an urban culture. This, for instance, is Mexico City. The north was logs, the south was stone. Fine cities, great churches, universities, and libraries. There was also a social life to match Milan or Madrid, a merchant class to match Lisbon or Seville, and public money for urban improvement, for paving, lighting, water supply, for planting trees along broad avenues. Some of the Baroque masterpieces of the 1700s are still standing in Mexico City. But by the 1700s, the Spanish Empire was declining, and the South declined with it. A new world was rising in the North. It had taken the North a long time to catch up. By the 1530s, when the French first sailed up the St. Lawrence River, the Spaniards were already well ensconced in Mexico, Peru, and Cuba. By the 1580s, when the English settled Newfoundland and tried to settle Virginia, which they named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Spanish universities in Lima and Mexico were already turning out more officials than Padua or Paris. There was no treasure in the north to attract colonists. There were furs, but you don't need a lot of people to trap animals and skin them. And the native Indians in the north were more warlike than those in the south. So really, the settlement of the North American continent didn't come until the 17th century. That's when the French founded Quebec and Montreal, and the English refounded Virginia. That's when the Pilgrims took 3 months and 5 days to sail from Plymouth in England to New Plymouth in what eventually became Massachusetts. The 17th century is when the Dutch founded New Amsterdam in what is now New York, when the Swedes founded New Sweden in what is now Delaware, and when John Locke wrote a constitution for the new state of Carolina, which was named, of course, after King Charles I. Tom Paine was going to call America the colony of all of Europe. Indeed, by the 18th century, America was attracting Welsh and Scots, Spaniards and Germans and Austrians to go along with the French and English and Dutch. And America was also a European colony in the sense that its new culture was European. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, for example, they had signed a covenant, which was a true social contract. They constituted themselves a civil body politic, they said, and they promised obedience to the just and equal laws that shall be thought meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. And so America was the colony of the European tradition of humanism and creativity born in the Renaissance, and culminating in the 18th century Enlightenment spirit. A spirit that the American myth and American possibilities fit very, very well. You can get an idea of this spirit when you go to Virginia and look at the extraordinary wilderness home that a young Virginia lawyer built himself in the 1760s. The lawyer's name was Thomas Jefferson, and he called his house Monticello, the Little Mountain. Jefferson made the plans for Monticello with the aid of a book of designs by the great Renaissance architect Palladio, whose 16th century creations you can still admire in northeast Italy. Palladio was coming back in vogue in the 18th century because his lines are the epitome of reason and harmony, symmetrical, proportional, never cold or dull or grandly stodgy. Some of the great buildings of 18th century England are Palladian or Neo-Palladian, but you wouldn't expect a Palladian mansion on the edge of Indian territory. Yet, that is what you get at Monticello, designed and built by a man who was as much a universal man as Alberti was in the Renaissance. Linguist, scientist, farmer, educator, town planner, and architect, horseman and musician, and since he was American, Jefferson was typically fond of technological improvements and gadgets. At Monticello, doors open when you approach them, a clock tells the days of the week, and the master's bed is placed so he can get out of it in either of two rooms. The American landscape may still have been wild in the 18th century, but a society that could produce a Jefferson was highly sophisticated, which also meant that it wasn't exactly poor any longer. Both the British and French colonies and their trade were now worth fighting for. They may not have been as important as the West Indies, which produced sugar and coffee and tobacco, and which both the British and the French thought worth far more than Canada, Canada which Voltaire described as a few acres of snow, and far more than the wilderness around the Ohio River, but they were still worth fighting for. In fact, the great 18th century wars between France and England were really about who was going to rule the seas and therefore command the colonies, because by then the crux of trade and wealth and power was seen as being overseas. So the British fought the French for world power, and in that fight, the British colonials in America helped their fellow British against the French and against the Indians who fought on the side of the French. It was in these French and Indian wars that men like George Washington got their military experience. By this time, the colonials had started to call themselves Americans, and they were glad when the Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced the French out of Canada, because that meant the French would no longer hamper their own movement westward. Nor would the French be there to arm and support the Indians to withstand the colonial advance into Indian territories. But when the French had been pushed out, the British, who had been seen as protectors, now began to appear as oppressors, or at least as a nuisance. Because the British didn't want trouble from their disobedient American children, they didn't want the Americans pushing into Indian lands and starting conflicts that would cost money. And even worse, the British, depicted here haughtily regarding a map of North America, the British wanted to tax Americans for services they, the British, provided, services which Americans now felt they could provide by themselves. The British wanted to harness the colonial economy to the interests of the home country. They wanted to control trade in the old mercantilistic way when the Americans were free traders. So almost as soon as the Treaty of Paris had been signed, British and Americans started to squabble, and within 12 years, they started to fight. That was the American Revolution.